ruins and reclamation. One of the things that I'm really excited about in my art practice is the way that ruins seem to offer to me a possibility for something new. You know, if there's a vacant lot or an abandoned building, in a way it's a kind of ruin, but it's also, in its unused state, it's a crack in the wholeness of things, and you might, something new, something interesting, something exciting might emerge from that, the way that grass grows up from a crack in the sidewalk, you know. So it's the flaws and the damaged things that kind of draw my attention right now. And I was working on this new piece that I'm calling How a Thing is Made. And while I was working on it, I was tidying the studio, and I came across a box, two little boxes actually, full of paintings that I made from a site of ruin. And I actually made them 30 years ago. They were part of my very first professional artist exhibition at the Orr Gallery back when it was on Franklin Street in Vancouver. And the painting, that show consisted of a set of 36 paintings and little bronze castings of icons of 1950s prosperity. A little rocket ship, a television with rabbit ears, an airplane, a little house, things like this. And they were arrayed in a certain way. So these paintings were left over from that show. And I looked at them and I was struck by them. I was very attracted to them. I thought they're kind of beautiful. There were paintings that I had made from photographs of the site of Expo 86. And I broke into the site about 6 months after the exposition had closed down. And the pavilions were all in a state of ruin. They were falling down, they were partly collapsed. There was grass growing up from the cracks in the sidewalk already 6 months later. And the whole thing had this kind of sense of being abandoned. It was before the property was sold and redeveloped into these monstrous glass towers that are there now. So, you know, indeed it was a site where there was going to be a kind of renewal, even if it's not the renewal that I want. But I loved the abandoned character of it. And I did a lot of photographs, and I made these little paintings, and each one of them is the size of a 35 millimeter film frame. So, and I actually made them with a set of oil paints that were normally used for retouching color photographs. So they're like some kind of, well, they're oil paintings, but they're some kind of hybrid thing in terms of their source between painting and photography. But most of all, each one has a little image of a fragment of ruin. And as I was working on the sculpture and finding these photographs, I thought they had something pretty interesting in common, because this piece started from a little bench that was sitting outside my studio. And I'd made it about 10 years ago, and I used it, dragged it into the studio when I needed a prop or whatever, and go back outside. So it's pretty decrepit. It's sort of a ruin itself. I had it in the studio at one point, and there was a 2x4 and a plank, and they tumbled, and they fell into a position just like this. Barely there, really precariously perched there. And I loved that. I measured it, I drew it out, I looked at it a lot, I thought about it a lot, and I thought that it was like just a sculpturally pretty wonderful form. And over the space of a couple of years, it sat around. Finally, I started to work with it, and I decided to formalize it. And it evolved in a slow way and felt like a reclamation of lost bits and pieces that were around the studio, plus new stuff. And as I developed it, I guess a key factor here is that in the sites of ruin, things are precarious. They're falling down. They're on the point of collapse, but not quite collapsed. And this had that same condition. So that was the drawing card for me. That was the thing that held me in there. So I thought to formalize this array of parts on the top And I started working on that, and the whole thing was on the ground. It needed to be elevated. And over a period of time, the work developed such that it developed a set of layering of sculptural and support elements. So at first, this was the sculpture on this base. But then I elevated it because I needed it up higher, and I got a new base for it, which was this. And then to help clarify that, I put the bench up on little posts, so it floats up off the base, so there's a kind of separation there. But then this support needed, I just had it up on sawhorses, so that needed to be, again, propped up. So in making the legs for this, the support for this, I referred back to this structure here in making the end post down there. And I gave that a high degree of finish to echo this, so that if this is the sculpture and that's the base, then this becomes the sculpture to this base, but then this becomes the sculpture to that base, but that base is also a kind of sculptural form, referring back to the original sculpture. So there's a kind of Mobius strip of referentiality built into this, and it curls back on itself. I think that's how a thing gets made. That's the title. So the work has to do with this precarious condition, but also with how things get generated, how they may be coming apart, but they're held together at the same time. I think it's sometimes, I don't like to lay a meaning onto the work. I like to think of the work as being a thing itself, that rather than representing something, rather than meaning something, simply offers us a thing, and the thing has certain conditions. And it's the conditions of existence, or perhaps even the ontology of the thing itself, that interests me. So for this, the condition that I was engaged with were the condition of diverse kinds of things coming together into a precarious situation. So, on the one hand, I like to avoid saying this means such and such. But on the other hand, there is a kind of analogy, I think, between things like this, between every work of art, and ourselves. A long time ago, a friend of mine said to me that, basically everything we make at artists is a kind of pathetic self-portrait. So, I ask, how is this a self-portrait? Or how is this a portrait? How is this a kind of personality or an entity? What are its conditions such that it is that? Well, it's put together of bits and pieces. Found things, fabricated things, modified things. In a way, it's analogous to how we construct ourselves. I might be wearing a branded t-shirt or a branded pair of jeans, and so that becomes part of who I am. Part of myself is given to me genetically. Part of it is given to me through my upbringing. Part of it is given to me through self-determination. And I'm lucky enough that, I was born in the right place and time, that I'm not completely subject to my environment. Maybe. Or if I am, it's in a pretty, in a way that allows me a certain kind of range of flexibility and movement. But the salient thing is that I am a kind of condition, in a kind of condition that's analogous to the kinds of sculptures that I'm able to make, the kinds of artworks that I'm able to make. And that's this. This feels to me like a really important work. For me personally, but also in the realm of artistic production generally, in the sculptural realm. I've said it before, I'll say it again. In a post-truth world, I enjoy the potentially radical presence of sculpture as a fact, as a thing in the world. Whatever this is, it's a thing in the world. It's a fact. If you bump into it, you feel it. It pushes back, if you start ascribing meaning to it and get fancy like that, well, maybe that's factual and maybe that's totally a fiction. It's probably a fiction. What remains, though, is this. And the potential of sculpture is that it continues to confront us with its materiality, with its substance. I can pretend that this means, oh, my grandmother's golden locks, or Goldilocks' grandmother. But whatever I say about it, it still comes back to being this stuff here, sensorially available to me, and it insists on itself in a certain way. That's the potential of sculpture broadly, and I think this particular piece does that in a really important way for us today. It's a bold claim. You know, somebody can shoot me down for it, and I hope they do. but I'll fight back a little bit. No, I'll let the work fight back. Mm-hmm. So that was the development of this, and I was developing this, and I was thinking about these paintings and putting this exhibition together. My studio is full of works right now that have not yet been exhibited, and I was looking forward to the chance to bring them here and you know, do this big exhibition. And the more I thought about it, the more, oh, that work fell to one side, that work fell to one side, and I was finally left with one sculpture and 5 panels, each panel bearing 3 paintings. And I brought them down to the gallery and installed them, and there was no place to put the 5th panel, so one of those got sidelined. So what we're left with is a really spare show. It's economical. It is, well, people have said it's elegant. I'll go with that. But I think that everything that's here is necessary, but also everything that's here occupies its own specific space. So that while there's a relationship among the parts, each part has the room to exist, to have its own presence. Super important. Yeah. And I had to modify all those little paintings quite substantially before re-exhibiting them, so they don't look, the way they're presented is quite different from what they were.